Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jerichoholic8704, and I believe in the power of love. I do. I really do. And honestly, guys, I think wrestling could use more love angles because truly love is a beautiful thing. Look, I have been swarming myself as of late with mediums related to the subject of love and relationships. I just read Romeo and Juliet for the 50th time. Great play, by the way. If you haven't read it, you really should. I was playing Catherine last night, a great game based around relationships. And in the midst of playing it, a fox outside my house just let out this mating call. So even the fox knows that love is truly, the all-powerful force that all the other mediums claim it to be. But I will say the fox mating call was truly, truly devastating to my ears. I've never heard anything like that before in my life. I honestly thought someone was getting attacked outside my window, but 'tis neither here nor there. Hopefully that wasn't the case. I mean, I'm assuming it was just a fox. I looked up like animal mating calls, and the fox was the one that closely resembled the sound I heard. So I'm just going to assume that that was the case. It was just a fox that was in heat. But anyway, I started thinking about love and wrestling, because here's the thing: wrestling and romance, they kind of go hand in hand, and some of the best storylines we've seen are romance angles, and I think that has a lot to do with just who we are as people. I think anyone, no matter who you are, no matter what walk of life you're from, no matter just anything about you, we're all human, and I think we can all relate to the idea of a love triangle or some sort of conflict in love. It's shit like that. We eat that shit up. We see it in movies, we see it in plays and books and any sort of entertainment. Even in real life, we see, I'm sure anyone listening to this has had some sort of relationship drama. It might not have been your own. It might have been, a friend, a family member, but I'm sure you've been involved or entangled somehow in some sort of romantic turmoil. And to me, these are some of the strongest storylines, and these are some of my favorites. So what I want to do is I just want to kind of give a brief overview of some of my favorite and least favorite romance angles in wrestling. And when I made a list, I didn't really rank them or anything. I just kind of made a list in chronological order of certain storylines I wanted to highlight here. And they're all WWE because they were the first ones that came to my mind. I really can't think of any that really stood out to me. I do remember the one that was bad was, I think there was one in TNA. It had to do with AJ and Dixie Carter. And there was that other woman, I'm forgetting her name. It was like Claire something, or I don't know. They ended up throwing a baby at AJ. I don't remember where it went, but it was just a train wreck. I think that was around the time that TNA was kind of hot, in 2012. They were kind of starting to turn a corner, but then it kind of just went right back downhill. I don't know. TNA is just it's a whole ordeal. But anyway, I wanted to go over just some of my favorite and least favorite angles, starting with one of my favorites, Hogan and Savage and Elizabeth. To me, this is the OG love angle. This is the modern day love angle from the golden age, I should say. And what's great about this is, and what's great about a lot of the romantic storylines that I end up liking is there's a common theme. It's either relatability or people playing the perfect part. And in this case, it's kind of both. We have the idea of Savage being the overprotective husband, the jealous husband. Shit like this happens all the time. And Hogan, who is just such a white meat baby face that, all of his actions to the untrained eye, and might seem kind of like he's trying to swoop in and steal Elizabeth. But we all know, knowing Hogan, he's honorable, he's a good guy, he's just trying to help Elizabeth. There was no sort of ulterior motive here. So Savage is the clear heel, Hogan is the clear face. And I do like this just because of the traditional roles of the romance angle. We have a clear-cut bad guy, a clear-cut good guy. But the thing that's really great about some of the future angles is when those lines are blurred, and we'll get to that in a bit. But I really do like how they set it up here. It was a slow burn. Hogan and Savage start out as teammates, start out as friends, business associates, and gradually you see Elizabeth grow more and more towards Hogan, maybe not even romantically interested. It's never explicitly stated that she loved Hulk Hogan and shit like that. It was just Savage being jealous. And again, this kind of goes back to how love can really influence how we translate our performance in our personal life. If you have people who are legitimately married and legit have feelings for each other, like Elizabeth and Savage, I remember a lot of wrestlers. I think Bret Hart was one of them, who in his one of his shoot interviews, he mentioned how Randy Savage was legitimately overprotective of Elizabeth because he was really scared that a lot of guys were looking at her. And Bret Hart even admitted, yeah, I looked at her too. So it's Savage kind of had some ground for his on edge nature, if you know what I mean. And one of my favorite scenes from this whole angle is it was the scene after Saturday night's main event when the Twin Towers, that whole fiasco where Elizabeth gets knocked down and Hogan goes and carries her to the back, leaving Savage behind. And then Savage and Hogan start arguing. And then there's that whole thing where like Elizabeth is on the trainer's table and they're in the trainer room and Hogan's checking in on her. And then Savage and Hogan start going at it, and then they just start beating each other up in the trainer's room. So it's like all this commotion, all this shit is flying everywhere. They're brawling, and then you have Elizabeth who's like half knocked out, half unconscious, but is like screaming. And like that's what that's what I fucking love about these kind of angles. It's when like the two men are fighting and the woman's just like screaming and crying in the background. It's so melodramatic, it's so cliche. But here's the thing with wrestling, I'm not expecting a Shakespearean play. You know what I mean? I'm not expecting some expert writing. What you do is you need to hit the key points, and you need to hit the key points that will get people emotionally invested in the storyline. And to, like this whole scene, this whole angle right here, this one moment in the trainer's room was more than enough to get people invested. And then you had the whole thing of, who is Elizabeth going to be in the corner of at WrestleMania 5? That was like a whole money-making segment. Imagine that today, like some valet is like, whose corner am I going to be in? That's like, in the 30-minute segment on a Raw hour. But it was a whole big angle on Saturday night's main event. And you fast forward, eventually, Hogan turns heel. I'm sorry, not Hogan. Yeah, that wasn't until the 90s. Savage turns heel, and he goes with Sherry. And then we fast forward a little bit to WrestleMania 7, which, one of my favorite old school WrestleMania matches of all time. One of my favorite matches ever with Ultimate Warrior and Macho King. Fantastic match, but the match was great, but the post-match will always be what was remembered. And when they have that reunion, they embrace, and Hogan has Elizabeth on her shoulders. And I love that iconic shot of that one fan just crying. And could you really even blame him for crying? Like, this was just such a perfect angle. It was so great. And it wasn't very innovative. It was very by the books. But in a situation like this, I think this is what you want. You have your clear-cut villain. You have your clear-cut hero. And it's all over a relationship, and which is a lot of people can relate to that. And, in that golden age of wrestling, it worked. Now, I think we had a little bit of like a nuanced version of this storyline a couple years later. And by that, I mean the Stephanie McMahon, Triple H, and Kurt Angle storyline. Now, you could say this romantic storyline kind of started earlier as like a, kind of drama between Test and the McMahons and Triple H. But, I think this all really kickstarted into a memorable angle when you had Triple H and Stephanie aligning. They became, the power couple on Raw. And then you threw Kurt Angle in the mix. So what was so great about this storyline is it's very, very similar in many ways to the Savage, Hogan, Elizabeth storyline. But the thing is, you had two heels, basically. You had this unholy alliance that was kind of breaking from the seams, and it was kind of turning Triple H face. If you go back to that Unforgiven match, which I watched in anticipation for this little video here, Triple H got a massive ovation. I shouldn't say massive. He got an ovation when he came out, and Kurt Angle was the one who was booed. And if you look at the highlight package, they build Kurt Angle as the villain in this storyline. Triple H didn't have his shining moments. It was more like the giant misunderstanding. This is almost like a Shakespearean comedy. Like everything, except it wasn't through words. It was all physical action. Everything Triple H did was he was just the wrong place at the wrong time. So Triple H is playing the jealous husband here, thinking that his new business associate is coming after his wife. And Stephanie is so oblivious to it all. She doesn't really see what Kurt Angle's ulterior motives are. However, what is so great about this storyline is Kurt Angle. I can't tell if Triple H or Kurt Angle is my favorite part. If Stephanie McMahon was there, she played her role correctly. She was fine. But Kurt Angle was so great at being like the earnest, loyal, happy-go-lucky white meat babyface in front of Stephanie McMahon and in front of her only. And then as soon as she turned her back, he was such a conniving little bitch to Triple H. It was great. And like Triple H, I think, became the babyface in this situation because, fans could see it. And I'm sure this is another one of those situations where it's like fans can sympathize. Even if someone as dastardly as Triple H, who's been a heel for such a long time, people can still sympathize with him because it's like this guy is just trying to protect his girlfriend and he's not trying to make sure anyone else comes after her, and he just can't catch a break because everything he does, he accidentally hit Stephanie, like at the SummerSlam match, he took her out. Then there was that other time, I think he was trying to pedigree Kurt Angle and Stephanie tried to stop him and he elbowed her thinking it was like a ref or another wrestler. You had all of this shit happened to Triple H to where he just couldn't catch a break. And again, Stephanie's so oblivious to it all. And then hell freezes over for just a brief moment. And Stephanie convinces them to, buddy up again and still be, business is business. And like, she always did her best to try and smooth it over, but she would only do it for just a little bit. And then the tempers would flare right back up again. No matter what she did, she couldn't stop these two from going at it. It was just a very, very, very fun storyline to go back and watch. It's a lot of fun, but the problem is it just didn't end on a really high note. At the end of the day, I think the plan, and I might be wrong about this, the plan was for Stephanie to go with Kurt Angle, and I guess they would kind of form like a heel faction there, and Triple H would go on his own and become a babyface, because this storyline, the way it was headed, especially after that Unforgiven match, it was really headed towards Triple H becoming a babyface, and I think it would have been a more effective turn if you had Stephanie join with Kurt Angle. Instead of low blowing Kurt at that Unforgiven match, she low blows Triple H and joins forces with Kurt. And maybe they can kind of do what, Stephanie and Triple H did to Vince. They could do that to Triple H, where it's like, we knew all along. This was all a ruse. We were just trying to lower your guard, yada, yada, yada. We're the real couple. And I think Triple H might have been the one who kind of kiboshed that, saying like, it doesn't make sense for her to go with Kurt over me. And then we have Triple H as the top heel, essentially, in late 2000, early 2001, until Stone Cold turned heel. So, I mean, I guess it makes sense. If you're looking at it from a Triple H perspective, you don't want to turn heel. You don't want to turn face when you have Rock and Stone Cold. I mean, like, in most cases, if you have like a face on top, you don't want to turn face because you're going to be number 2. But in that case, you're going to be number 3 because 1 and 2 are Austin and Rock. Just interchange them. It could basically be either or. And Triple H couldn't compete with that. He knew he couldn't. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that, the storyline kind of panned out the way it did and kind of had a flat ending, which is the only real criticism I have of the storyline, because it's so funny. It's so fucking good. And, this one might not be as dramatic as the Hogan Savage Elizabeth one, in terms of just like the sheer idea of like, here's such a heroic guy versus such a jealous guy, like the clear-cut good versus evil. And here, everyone has their own mix of good and bad. Kurt Angle a little bit more than Triple H, but it was really funny just to watch these two guys go at it, especially when you're supposed to hate both of them. But you kind of had to sympathize with Triple H just a little bit, because, he really wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just he was just a hothead. You know what I mean? Like, steam was coming out of his ears every single second, which was like a perfect role for Triple H. Everyone played their role extremely well. All right, so moving on to another storyline. This one is one of my least favorites, but this one's almost like so ridiculous that I like it. And that's Stacy, Scott Steiner, and Test. And the reason I have this storyline on here is just because, to me, this one was always so ridiculous. And this took place in like 2003-ish. So I was, kindergarten, first grade. But I vividly remember watching Raw at this time. And even as a 6-year-old, I was like, why the heck is Stacy Keibler dating Scott Steiner? Like, it just, to me, that made no sense. Even as a young chap, I knew that one of these things was not like the other. Stacy Keibler could have any man she fucking dated George Clooney. You know what I mean? And you're telling me she's going to date Scott Steiner? I mean, again, no offense to Steiner, but like, dude, George Clooney. So here's the thing. What I love about this storyline was just the ridiculousness of it. I absolutely, like, first of all, the epitome of the storyline was that Bad Blood match where Steiner tried to do like the double axe off the apron, and he just tripped and fell and like double axed Test's ankles or something. Like, it was just a complete disaster. What I remember was it was just a very back and forth. It really had no resolve either, because they both ended up turning heel. And then I think the payoff to this was like, Test pump handle slam Stacy, and then they joined forces. This really was one of the bottom tier romantic storylines, because Scott Steiner seemed like the honorable man, because clearly like the Test Stacy relationship was doomed to start because Test was always a tool, and that was the storyline. And like eventually Steiner beat Test at Bad Blood, and then he got Stacy, and then I think obviously they didn't have a pay-per-view match in July. But I do remember them having a pay-per-view match in August where Test ultimately got Stacy back. And then they had the match at Unforgiven where if Steiner won, he would get Stacy back. But if Test won, Steiner would become his manservant. So eventually, I think Test won because Stacy tried to do like some interference. She fucked it up and she screwed Steiner. So then he became the manservant. And then I think they both turned heel, right? They both turned heel and they just abused Stacy Keibler, which like was a total like just what a fucking end to this storyline. Like, what's the moral here? Like, if you can't beat him, join him. Like, if your girl fucks you over too many times, just start beating her up. Like, god damn it. Like, what the fuck? So I think it ended because Foley like fired both of them and then he frees Stacy Keibler. So it's like, okay, you know, if you have an abusive relationship, call your boss. Like, I don't know. Like, this is like a really stupid ending to the storyline. I think this one was just doomed to fail from start to finish, just knowing the players involved. When you look back on it, you know, like you got Hogan, Savage Elizabeth, Triple H, Stephanie McMahon, Kurt Angle, and then you got Stacey Steiner Test. You know, this kind of was the B squad coming in for their for this love angle. But don't worry, we had another love angle in 2003, and unlike this one, this storyline was the fucking best. This is probably my personal favorite love angle in wrestling, and one of my favorite storylines ever. You guys know, it's the Jericho, Christian, Trish love triangle. This storyline was fucking awesome. I remember, I think it was just one day, I watched every single segment from all the Raws, and what I really miss a lot about, you know, the storytelling in WWE is that, like, and you saw it a lot with the Triple H, Stephanie McMahon, Kurt Angle storyline, but to a lesser extent because they had way much more TV time than these three did in 2003. But, you know, like, you got a little piece of the story every single week. And it seems like nowadays in wrestling, like, you can hardly keep up with stories because they either drop them or they just kind of blow their load really quickly. But here it was like so intricately placed and everything. And what I really love about the storyline, the more I look back on it with a critical eye, is it did an amazing job of turning heel Jericho into a great babyface. And again, like the origins of the storyline was the whole like bet between Jericho and Christian on who could sleep with leader Trish first. And I mean, obviously it's like very juvenile and like clearly these are two heels, they're two dicks, you know what I mean? And what I love about it is you see Jericho slowly start to develop feelings for Trish Stratus, and he starts doing things that are more and more heroic. And like what's really cool is like in the beginning of the storylines, Jericho's a heel to like every single person on the planet except Trish Stratus, which is like, you know, how like a lot of people are like, you know, they're kind of dicks, but then they're around that one girl that they like, they're gonna, you know, try and clean up their act. And then you see Jericho doing more and more heroic things, like he sacrificed his world championship match so Bischoff didn't book Trish with Kane. He saved her from Kane a couple of times, got the knee injury and everything. And then you have Christian as the jealous friend. And Christian really shined in this storyline. He was awesome. He was very funny, which is like something, again, like this was kind of like the Triple H McMahon Angle storyline where it's very, very funny. And like a lot of the dynamics with Christian and Jericho were great. And then you slowly see that Jericho starts to take priority with Trish over Christian. This whole storyline is so much fun. It's so fun to watch, and it's so great seeing Jericho slowly realize he's becoming more and more affectionate towards Trish. And it's really, you kind of see like a vulnerable side from the heel, which instantly turns him face. You know, you didn't have to do this big heroic rescue. Just seeing a more humanized version of a heel is enough to turn him face. The only thing I really kind of am up in the air with this storyline is the ending, because it ends up where Trish turns on Jericho at WrestleMania 20 and she goes with Christian. Apparently this was a Vince McMahon last second call. It did do a great job of generating heat, and it did turn Trish heel after she had been a face for such a long time. And I do agree that like it was an effective move. It was a memorable moment. I don't think it hurt the storyline that much. It was a nice like twist ending. But at the same time, like, you know, Trish's explanation to Jericho like a couple weeks later was like, you just weren't there for me. Christian was there for me. But then again, Christian was the one who like annihilated Trish and like put her in the walls of Jericho, injured her back and everything. Like Christian literally beat up Trish in this storyline. So it's like, like the reasoning didn't really make sense afterwards. I just think it was a bad call because I think Jericho and Trish were supposed to ride off in the sunset. And I think that would have been a good finish to the storyline because, and like you could argue, like, you know, she should have turned on him. But my argument for why Trish should have gone with Jericho is Jericho redeemed himself. This was like a redemption arc for Chris Jericho. You know what I mean? He had proven that he was no longer a heel and he was going to be a babyface. So I think the babyface should have gone with the babyface. I just think it makes most sense that way. Had Christian not beaten up Trish Stratus, I could see where they were coming from a little bit. I can see it. If Christian had maybe saved Trish once, maybe like in a really, really dire moment, you know, more so than all the other times Jericho saved Trish Stratus, I could see where they're coming from. But the fact that like Christian literally tried to hurt her, I can't buy it. So, I mean, I guess that's like my only gripe with the storyline. Again, I don't think it's the worst end, but I just think it could have been more effective if we had, you know, Jericho and Trish, you know, go together at the end of WrestleMania. And if you want to turn Trish heel, you could always do the breakup angle. You could always, like, that's a whole other angle you could have taken it, where, you could have had Jericho and Trish together, and maybe, Jericho, Trish shows signs of becoming a heel, and Jericho's like, I didn't sign up for this, yada, yada, yada. And then you have a whole other angle you could take where eventually she turns on Jericho and goes with Christian. I think maybe they kind of blew their load a little too early with the WrestleMania 20 turn. I think you could have played out even a little bit more, because I think people were really invested in the storyline. I know I was. When I was a kid, holy shit, this was like my favorite storyline. And, when I found out that Trish turned on Jericho, I was beyond pissed, man. I was so pissed. God, I was so invested in that storyline, it wasn't even funny. But, as we know, that storyline wasn't real, but that is unlike the Matt Hardy, Edge, and Lita storyline. And this storyline was very, very interesting because it all flew over my head. When Matt Hardy started using the real names, I was like, what the fuck is he talking about? Because again, I was but a wee lad when this storyline happened. But I also have to mention the Kane storyline because, unfortunately for Lita, the last, 2 or 3 years of her career were just dedicated to these love angles. Some good, some bad. The Kane angle was atrocious because Kane became like the redeemed rapist. I mean, I don't know. It was really, really stupid. There was the whole, like, Lita's pregnant, but then, like, Kane basically said, like, I raped Lita in his promo. Like, it wasn't explicitly stated, but, like, it's called subtext, people. Like, he raped her. That's pretty much what the storyline was implying. But then Kane turns babyface. I again, like, that whole part, I don't want to get into it, but that whole part was just fucked up. But the real meat and potatoes of this came with Matt Hardy, Edge, and Lita. So after Lita turned on Kane and went with Edge, those two are coming. They're doing their thing. They have their feud with Kane. That blows off. And then when you have Matt Hardy come back, and this storyline, to me, again, this kind of missed the mark a little bit. It had the reality in it. It had the intensity. And I think this is probably the most realistic, because it was, of all the storylines on this list, or, like, in the topics of this video, I should say. This one felt personal because it was. And I think the modern day wrestling fan could probably relate to this the most, especially since, Matt Hardy, again, like, people, you couldn't really ask for something better because people were playing their roles so well, because Edge is such like he's a really good looking guy. You know what I mean? He's got the long blonde hair, he's jacked, he looks good, he's a good talker. And then you have Matt Hardy, who I'm not saying he's ugly or anything, but, Matt Hardy kind of is more of a common man. He's more of a country boy. And I think wrestling fans really, really resonated with a storyline like this because, the guy who everyone loved, Matt Hardy, he was beloved by the fans, and they really felt like Lita fucked him over. And I mean, I remember Lita was on Bite This, that one like web show that WWE had, kind of ahead of its time, if I do say so myself. It was a little bit more of a shoot style interview. And Lita, does have a valid point where it's like, I'm not obligated by the fans to be Matt Hardy's girlfriend, which is really, it's true. But, I mean, like, you have to understand, this is wrestling fans we're talking about, and they felt passionate about this. It's like, you fucked over this guy. And I mean, to be fair, they cheated on each other with, they cheated on their significant others, Edge and Lita did. And so, like, from that perspective, like, the fans do have a point of like, wow, you screwed Matt. But at the same time, it's like, Lita does have a right to, sleep with whoever she wants to sleep with. You know what I mean? That is true. It doesn't mean you should cheat, but again, like, the storyline had a lot of layers to it the more and more I look on it. And, props to Matt Hardy and Edge for being able to put aside, personal matters and generate a lot of business, because I thought this was great. In terms of matches, I mean, I think they kind of missed the mark with the SummerSlam match, but I think they redeemed themselves with the Unforgiven match. The thing is, they kind of made Matt Hardy look like a geek in this storyline, but the fans just loved him so much that it really didn't matter. They were just so behind him that he could basically do anything and the people would love it. And I think the blow-off should have been Unforgiven, because ultimately Matt Hardy got his revenge. He got the twist of fate on Lita, which everyone marked out for, and I'm sure people loved seeing that. But I think the final real match of the storyline was the Loser Leaves Town match, where like, Lita tied up Matt Hardy in the ropes, and like, he had to watch as Edge slowly climbed up the ladder and got the Money in the Bank briefcase. And it was like, what a way to send Matt Hardy out. Like, they made him look like a loser. And like, I understand that Edge is going to be your top guy, and you don't really have any plans for Matt Hardy. So at the end of the day, wrestling logic, Edge should end up winning the feud, because Edge and Lita are your main event act. But at the same time, it's like, I don't think it would have hurt Edge at all to just kind of put Matt Hardy over and have it be that with the Unforgiven steel cage match. I think that was just the perfect way to end it. But I mean, again, I can't really complain too much, because I did think the storyline rooted in a lot of realism, turned out really great. I don't know if, you had to go the shoot work angle. I mean, I guess if rumors and, the word hadn't been leaked that Edge and Lita had cheated on their significant others, you didn't have to go this route. But because all the fans knew, you might as well not insult their intelligence and just go straight up with the work shoot. It got the people invested, and I think at the end of the day, that's all you want out of an angle. So I think it did its job, and it did its job very well. So then romance angles, from what I remember, were kind of dormant for a while, and then we had one of the worst. Oh my God. Eve Torres, Zack Ryder, and John Cena. I remember this storyline just being horrific because, for one, they made this is when they officially took Zack Ryder, placed his testicles on the table, then they took like a butcher knife and just whacked him off. Like, holy shit. They made this guy look like a fucking geek in this storyline. And the thing is, it was all tied. It eventually got mixed up with the John Cena Kane storyline. Like, Kane somehow managed to like weave his way into this storyline. There was also like that one weird Raw where like he got all up in Eve's face. Again, like, I don't know what it is with Kane and implied rape, but I don't know if he raped Eve in this storyline too, or if he just kind of like whispered too close to her face. But I remember Eve Torres vividly laughing during that scene. So clearly she took it very seriously. So, Zack Ryder's in like his wheelchair and his neck brace, and the whole storyline was just revolving around him trying to muster up the courage to ask Eve out. And then John Cena saves Eve from the ambulance, and, Eve kisses John Cena, and then Zack's all upset and befuddled, and, he thought John Cena was his friend, and then he wheels away. He's in a wheelchair, and like, he can't take the news like a man. He has to just like cry and wheel himself away like a pathetic loser. And then the only good part about this storyline, the only thing I love about it, is Eve goes to console Zack and be like, oh my God, I was so wrapped up in the moment. Let's just be friends. And she drops the let's be friends line, and then everyone boos. And it's because, I know, it's not because they had sympathy for Zack Ryder, because no one could at that time, because he was just a fucking tool. But everyone booed because every wrestling fan, no matter who you are, every wrestling fan has heard the line, let's just be friends. I certainly have. And I know every single wrestling fan listening to this, you have heard that line. Maybe not directly, but I'm sure you have at some point. It's just a true universal fact. It is a truth universally acknowledged that all wrestling fans in search for a girlfriend have heard the words, let's just be friends. Truth universally acknowledged. If anyone knows what book A Truth Universally Acknowledged is from, gold star for you. Anyway. So this storyline, just what I noticed is the more complicated they tried to make these love angles, the less fun they were. It was very simple in the old days. You had jealous Randy Savage, you had jealous Triple H and conniving Kurt Angle, you had, dickhead Chris Jericho and Christian, and then Jericho slowly becoming the good guy. It's like they're very simple stories to follow. This one was all full of like, did John Cena embrace the hate or not? Did Kane, did he force John Cena to embrace Eve, thus he embraced the hatred? I don't know what the fuck they were talking about half the time. And it all climaxed with Zack Ryder almost fighting John Cena. John Cena like winded back a punch to defend himself from, I don't even know how he could. The very idea that John Cena had to defend himself against broken down, heartbroken Zack Ryder is just ridiculous to me. So, Zack Ryder attempts to throw a punch. John Cena winds one back, and then Zack Ryder just cowers in fear and wheels himself up the ramp. And then I take it back. There was two good parts about this storyline, and the second being the time Kane just wheels Zack Ryder off the stage ramp. That was also a great moment. And as far as I'm concerned, that was pretty much the end of the storyline. Oh, wait, no, I'm lying. It wasn't. It was WrestleMania 28. Zack Ryder gets nutshotted by Eve, and Eve turns heel. Like, whoop-de-fucking-do. Way to make everyone in the storyline look worse. Everyone came out awful. John Cena, it had no effect on him. He shouldn't have even been there to start. Eve Torres ended up turning heel for no reason. I will say, though, administrative assistant Eve Torres was probably the best Eve Torres. So, I mean, I guess there's, a positive there. And Zack Ryder got nutshotted back into the low card. So, yikes. Not a good look for anyone involved. So moving on to the latter portion of the 2010s, we had a couple of angles. I'm going to kind of breeze over these pretty quickly because they're not really that noteworthy. We had one that didn't age particularly well, and that was the WrestleMania 33 storyline with Cena and Nikki versus The Miz and Maurice. I actually thought this one was pretty funny from the mocking standpoint. It really shows just how awkward that relationship between Nikki Bella and John Cena really was, because what I always found really striking about that storyline was just John Cena's whole portrayal on Total Divas and his whole attitude when he was with Nikki Bella. You know, John Cena is a very charismatic dude. And I understand, you know, he's constantly on camera, so he's going to have this persona of being like this wacky, fun-loving dude. And I'm sure behind closed doors, John Cena's different. But I can't imagine he's a fucking android. You know what I mean? Like, he has too much personality on camera to not have any sort of personality behind it, if that makes sense. Like, there's no way. I cannot fathom that someone is a performer to that caliber like John Cena is, and is able to engage with so many people, and is, you know, constantly having to talk and act and have this portrayal of this fun-loving babyface and not have a personality out of it. Like, Mrs. impersonation of Cena was perfect because that's how he was, and it was just so awkward. And like, the whole romance angle and the whole proposal at the end of the match was just so forced, and again, it did not age well in the slightest, as we all can see. And again, I'm just gonna say, like, ever since Cena and Nikki have split, like, I just feel like Cena's personality comes out more and more. It's almost just like he felt subdued next to Nikki Bella. So again, I just, like, this whole thing was kind of uncomfortable to watch from the start. I just liked watching them mock the true tomfoolery of John Cena as portrayed by Total Divas. It was just a mess from start to finish. Another one that was kind of a mess was Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch. Now, obviously, they are still a happy couple. Becky Lynch is now expecting a child, so that's great. But their portrayal, for a while, I thought, when they were doing this whole love angle with Seth Rollins, Becky Lynch, and they were doing the whole Corbin and Lacey Evans thing, and, you know, they were like, will this, you know, introduction of Lacey Evans test the relationship of Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch? Here's the thing. For a while, I was like, there's no way they're a couple, because there is no way a real life couple. I understand sometimes, you know, with couples, they don't act well on camera. I get that. I totally understand where you're coming from with that. However, you can't tell me that real life people don't have some sort of chemistry. They had negative chemistry. Like, Seth Rollins was like giving Becky Lynch noogies and like treating her like she was like a little brother or something. And I was like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, what is wrong with you? And just like, Seth Rollins was super cringy. Like, give me the tag, babe. Like, every mixed tag match was just a fucking disaster. It was all just so weird. And like, if I had to hear Seth Rollins say babe one more time, I was going to just literally blow a gasket. I will say the best part of the storyline, if I'm being 100% honest, was when Baron Corbin gave Becky Lynch the end of days. That was the only time I ever believed anything, because it was great, because he put his hands on another man's woman. And that is what all fans can relate to. You know what I mean? In terms of like Seth Rollins' rage. And I'm sure he had a place to go, because, you know, wrestlers aren't the best actors, but I'm sure Seth Rollins could immediately put himself in that scenario of like, what if a guy, you know, put his hands on my girlfriend? What would I do? And like, I think that was probably the only thing I liked about that storyline, that one brief moment in that one match. Other than that, their portrayal was literally garbage. It was awful. So that brings us to our final storyline of this video, and that is the Otis Mandy storyline. Again, this is one where they went kind of back to basics. They went by the book, and it was a very simple storyline with a very, very nice payoff. And what I like so far is they're still together. Now, I'm sure they'll inevitably break up. I'm sure they will. But honestly, you know, the direction they're going with Otis and having him be the Money in the Bank winner, if they want to kind of push Otis to the moon and have him be like a serious contention for like main event status, I'm fine with this. And I think Mandy should constantly be by his side. I think it's such a fun dynamic because, you know, Otis, more than pretty much anyone else we've talked about, is the common man. Like, I mentioned it with Matt Hardy because he's like kind of a country boy at heart and shit like that. But Otis is the wrestling fan. And I'm not even trying to be a dick. It's just the truth. Otis is a goofball. He's chunky. He's kind of clumsy. You know, like, one of my favorite moments of the storyline is when he hugged Mandy and there was just all these sweat stains on Mandy's dress. It was so fucking funny. Like, I love the idea of like just the fucking blonde bombshell like completely out of this world, Mandy Rose is dating Otis. Like, it's just from the start, it's ridiculous. And I understand that. And like, I'm sure someone could be like, oh, in the real world, would someone like Mandy Rose actually go for Otis? Maybe. I'm sure we've seen tons of, like, you've seen tons of couples where the attraction might not be equal. But the thing that is great about it is this could only work with a babyface duo. You can't turn these guys heel. It works as a babyface because what have we always heard? Personality is what matters most. And in relationships, that is true, but let's be real. You know, your physical attraction does play a role in it. But because everyone loves Otis, and because he's such a charismatic guy and such a fun-loving guy, we can understand why Mandy Rose loves Otis. I think this storyline works so well, and I think the introduction of Dolph Ziggler was such a good idea, because Dolph Ziggler is like a prime example of what like every guy would fear. You know, here comes the good-looking guy with the long blonde hair, and you know, he dresses nice, got a nice sense of style. He's a smooth talker, and he's just sliding right in to Mandy Rose's DMs. You know what I mean? Like, it worked out so well, and I just wish we could have had a live crowd for that WrestleMania match, because I think in front of 70,000 people, that Otis Ziggler match would have been something really to behold. I think it would have been great. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, it just, things couldn't turn out that way. And I mean, you couldn't really drag this storyline out anymore. You kind of had to pull the trigger, because it was kind of getting a little messy at the end with the whole Sonya thing. I don't mind Sonya's inclusion. I like the idea of maybe Sonya being like the shallow friend and not being supportive. But I just think they have so much to do with this storyline. Like, I'd hate for them to go with, you know, some sort of split. I think, honestly, I don't see the harm in keeping these two together for the foreseeable future. I think they're great together. And I mean, again, if you want to push Otis to be a main event player, I think having Mandy Rose in his corner would be so much fun. And I think it would be a really, really fun dynamic. And it would give, I feel like his charisma could rub off on Mandy Rose. And I'm not saying Mandy Rose is bad or anything, but, you know, she could use that extra ounce of personality that I think she might have been missing for the past couple of years. So I think there's a lot of mutual gain here. And I think from a storyline perspective, you know, again, very simple, nerdy guy falls in love with Bombshell. And then, you know, Bombshell starts to realize, like, hey, maybe this guy isn't as bad as people say he is. And I kind of find things that I like about him. A really, really great storyline. I wish it had a better climax with 70,000 people cheering for Otis. But again, like, it shows that charisma and personality can really make a storyline, and Otis is showing it in spades. So that is it for my little retrospective of wrestling romance angles. I know I missed a few here and there, and I know there have been some from other companies, and I kind of kept this strictly with WWE. But, you know, I do think, you know, it was a nice stroll down memory lane. I think there were more good than bad. I always think there should be at least one romance angle every year or two, just because I think they're just so great at building grudge matches, and they're such a great way to get people who, you know, you kind of want them in the main event spotlight. They can kind of get that little TV time and get, you know, some goodwill among the fans. I think they're a great tool and should be used more often. And they're some of my favorite storylines because they're the most relatable and they're really easy to get into. But that is it for me. My name is Jerichoholic8704. Believe in the power of love, everyone, and I will see all of you later.